Hold on the neck stalk, the grain of the wood. The rope burns on the man's neck. His chin is forced down by the weight of it. The crowd at the Ikur gate is watching. It is not cheering. His name is Lugalzagesi. Months ago, he called himself Lord of all the land from the Persian Gulf to the mountains beyond the sea. He had marched armies through every major city in Sumer and made their rulers bend. He is not crying. He has no more armies. At the edge of the square, a second man watches. He is not tall. He is not old. He does not look like a king. He is about to call himself one anyway. He is already thinking about what Lugalzagesi failed to understand. C. 2600 to 2340 BC. Here is the world he is looking at. Two rivers running southeast to the sea, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and between them a flat, dark-soiled plain holding a dozen cities, each ringed by mud brick walls, each answering to its own god and its own king. These cities had done something no people had done before them. They solved the problem of feeding crowds. The canals they dug turned scrub into farmland. The granaries they built could carry a city through a dry year. The scribes who counted the grain gave the world its first writing. Then they pointed it all at each other. The canals they dug could be damned to starve a neighbor. The surplus the scribes counted became the surplus that armies consumed. They had invented the tools of civilization. The problem those tools kept producing was war. Among these cities, Kish held the oldest claim to something like authority. The king list recorded it simply, not to Uruk, not to to Kish. The city did not need to be the strongest at any given moment. It held the prestige, and prestige in a world without a single governing power was the nearest thing to legitimacy anyone had. Every king wanted it. No king kept it. But Nippur was the real prize. It sat near the center of the plain, close enough to every city to matter, too far from any single border to hold easily. The temple of Enlil stood there. Whoever controlled Nippur held heaven's sanction over all of Sumer. Every king who wanted to be more than the king of one city made the journey to Nippur. They brought offerings to the temple. They inscribed their names in stone at the Gate of Enlil. None of them managed to hold it for long. The next king was always coming. This was the nature of the system. Not chaotic exactly, but built without any way to resolve itself. One city would rise, bleed its rivals dry, and then find itself bled in turn. The plain was too flat, the cities too close, the water too necessary to fight over only once. South of Nippur, between the cities of Lagash and Umma, there was a strip of irrigated land called the Gu Edena. It was not large, but it sat astride the canals that fed both cities, and so for 100 years, generation after generation, men died for it. Both cities left inscriptions recording the wars. Treaty broken, border stone moved, army sent back. The insults were pressed into clay so they would last, and they have lasted, and what they record is not evil but exhaustion. Two cities locked in a dispute the system had no mechanism to end. Then came Lugalzagesi of Umma. He looked at the system every king before him had played by and decided to play it differently. He did not want to win the next round of the border war, he wanted all of it. He started with Lagash, the city Umma had been bleeding against for generations, and he took it. Then he moved to Uruk, the old great city on the Euphrates, and he took that too. City after city bent or burned. He was building something no one in Sumer had ever held before. He went to Nippur, he made his offering to Enlil, he inscribed himself in stone above every name that had come before him. He was not wrong about what he had done. He had marched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains and made every city in between bow. But a title carved at Nippur was not the same as holding what you had taken. The cities were still there, their walls were still standing. He had put his boot on their throats, but he had not answered the question the system kept asking. What holds a dozen cities together when the man doing the holding is gone? He had no answer. The system had not changed. It had only found a new champion to exhaust. Remember what you were looking at. A world that had invented writing and law and the city itself, and turned every one of those inventions into a new way to bleed the city across the canal. The problem of crowds had been solved. The problem of cities had not. The answer came from a direction Lugalzagesi was not watching. While he was making offerings at Nippur, carving his name above the names of every king before him, someone else had been paying attention to all the things that had not worked. The man at the edge of the square. That is what is about to change. The man at the edge of the square has a name. He will take everything Lugalzagesi built and do something to it that no one in this world has yet managed. Whether what he builds can outlast the man building it, that is the question. C. 2370 to 2334 BC. He was watching. The city of Kish sat near the point where the two rivers drew closest, and it carried its own myth of dominion. Its king was Ur-Zababa. In his great hall, a young man was learning the oldest lesson the world had yet devised. The title of cupbearer sounds like a small thing. It was not. The man who carried the king's cup stood close enough to hear what the king whispered, close enough to be heard in return. He held correspondence. He managed access. He managed proximity. Kish sat on the northern edge of Sumer, not a purely Sumerian city. Two languages lived inside its walls: Sumerian in the temples and the records, Akkadian in the markets, spoken by people who had come down from the middle Euphrates and stayed. He was Akkadian by tongue and blood, serving in a world whose power spoke Sumerian. That gap, small enough to cross every morning and wide enough to see from across a room, was information. He understood something the old families of Kish did not: what their world looked like from outside it. Ur-Zababa, king of Kish, his city held the oldest reputation for kingship in the land, and he wore that inheritance the way men do when they have never had reason to question whether it might end. The cup went across the floor and the king took it without looking up. That was the arrangement. A cupbearer was useful precisely because no one counted him dangerous. He could move through the rooms where decisions were made and be taken for something smaller than he was. He watched who spoke first when the king entered. He watched whose eyes the king sought when difficult news arrived from the south. He watched which officials carried fear in their voices and which carried ambition. Power has a texture. You can learn to read it if you are content to wait. His name, Sharukin, means the true king. It is a throne name, the kind a man selects when his claim to rule requires an argument behind it. Centuries after he lived, the people of Babylon and Assyria would tell a story about where he came from. In their telling, his mother was a high priestess who could not keep him. She sealed him in a reed basket cocked with bitumen and set it on the Euphrates current. A gardener named Aki drew the basket from the water and raised the child as his own. It is a striking story. It was written down roughly 1600 years after Sargon lived. What it preserves is not how he was born. It preserves what he had become. Every story of the abandoned child follows the same logic. It says this man rose from nothing. It says the nothing did not hold him. The people who told it were not recording a birth. They were reckoning with a life that had grown too large for ordinary origins to contain. But here he is, not in a legend. Here he is in a hall in Kish, a clay vessel in his hands, a king who does not look up. Whatever his origins were, they carried him to this room, and this room is where the real education began. Then the king dreamed. The literary text that records it was composed centuries after the fact and survives only in fragments, but the shape of the thing is legible. Ur-Zababa had a dream that disturbed him, and when he woke, he looked at his cupbearer differently. What the king saw in the dream is lost to the gaps in the clay. What survives is the structure. A king who had trusted a man and then, in the space of a night, stopped. A king who found in sleep what the waking court had kept from him. Ur-Zababa moved against him, the text says as much. We do not know how or with what instruments or what the king believed he was preventing. We know only that the attempt failed. The cupbearer was still standing when the king was not. He founded a city and named it Akkad. He called it the city beloved of Ishtar. Scholars have been looking for it under the soil of the Middle Euphrates plain ever since. It has not been found. It sits where the inscriptions placed it, everywhere in the record, nowhere on the ground. He did not take Nippur, where the great temples held the spiritual authority of all Sumer. He did not march into Uruk, which Lugalzagesi had already bled for. He built his own city, a place with no old families, no layered obligations, no memory that predated him. He moved between languages the way he had moved between the rooms of the palace. Akkadian was his mother tongue, Sumerian was the language of temple and record and law. A man who holds both has a longer reach than one who holds only one. He had spent years practicing that reach. The cupbearer had learned in Kish what every great hall teaches, if you are patient enough to remain invisible. Who defers and who commands. Which general holds which road, where loyalty is purchased and where it is felt. He was building an empire before he had a single army to build it with. To the south, the cities were fighting their usual quarrels. Lugalzagesi had marched through all of them and made their rulers kneel, calling himself king of all the land from the Gulf to the mountains. He was not wrong about his strength. He had simply never considered who was watching from the north. The man who would undo him was still learning, still carrying a cup across a polished floor, still being taken for something small. The longest preparations leave no trace. You do not know a weapon is being made until it arrives. C. 2334 BC. At the Gate of Enlil, one world ends. He had been standing at the edge of the square. Now the square belongs to him. The man in the neckstock walks ahead, shoulders forward, chin pulled down by the grain of the wood, and the crowd parts to let them both pass without a sound. Lugalzagesi of Uruk. Months ago, he had called himself king of all the land and carved the gods of every city in Sumer as witnesses to his authority in stone at Nippur. The gods are still standing in their temples. He is standing in a neckstock. His inscription at Nippur had listed them one by one, the gods of Nippur, of of Lagash, of every sacred precinct between the rivers. He had written their names as guarantors of his power. He had not consulted them about what would happen next. The stone inscription is still there. The words are still carved, but the man who carved them is now kneeling before the god he named as witness, and the man standing behind him has not yet claimed anything. He is letting the gate do the claiming for him. The priests of Enlil watch from the temple steps. They do not intervene. They have seen kings bring tribute to this gate, asking for rain and harvests and long reign. They have not seen a victor bring his prisoner here to kneel. The god's city says nothing. It says nothing, and in that silence, Sargon has his answer. He has not asked permission. He has not petitioned for approval. He has appeared at the most sacred threshold in Sumer with the former master of Sumer at the end of a rope. That is enough. Consider what Sargon has done here before he leaves Nippur. He has not demanded a new inscription. He has not smashed Lugalzagesi's stone. He has simply stood before it with the man who carved it in a neckstock. The inscription still names all its divine witnesses. They have all just watched. Look at the map. Nippur sits near the center of the plain. Uruk, Lugalzagesi's own city, lies 100 miles to the south. Sargon has the symbolic victory. Now he turns and marches for the walls. The walls of Uruk were old and high and had held the city through generations of war. Sargon dismantled them. Not breached, not burned, taken down. The ring of mud brick that had made Uruk capable of defending itself was methodically removed from the plain. Without walls, a city cannot shelter a rival claimant. It cannot recruit behind protection. It cannot hold out while it sends for help. An unwalled city on a flat alluvial plain is a crowd of people with nowhere to go. That is what he made of Uruk. He did not stop at Uruk. Follow the route south and east along the river channels. Lagash, Umma, each city in sequence, each one perhaps believing it might be spared, each one discovering it would not. The walls came down at every stop. These cities had spent centuries fighting each other. They had their own gods, their own granaries, their own understanding of who should rule between the rivers. Sargon did not ask what they thought.
He came, he dismantled what they had built to defend themselves, and he moved on. Think about what that felt like at night. The darkness around an unwalled city is the same darkness as always, but the thing that cut it off is gone. The plain is open in every direction, and somewhere out there, not asking for anything, is the army that made it so. When you have taken every city between the rivers, there is still the question of where the land ends. Sargon answered it the only way a conqueror of his time could answer it. He marched to the sea. Picture the moment. The alluvial plain behind him, the flat shimmer of the Persian Gulf ahead, his army standing at the edge of the water. He raises his weapons and washes them in the sea. Not a soldier's act, a boundary drawn in salt water. His own inscriptions record the act, a ritual claim written in the language of weapons and water, preserved in later copies, still legible across 4,000 years. The Persian Gulf was not a destination, it was a declaration. Everything from city to empty plain, from the rivers to the sea was now, by the logic of that gesture, one thing, one territory, one domain. The question of who would hold it after him was still unasked. He had taken everything from the rivers to the sea. No rival city left with its walls intact, no king between the two rivers who had not bent or fled or been brought to a gate in a neckstock. The world between the rivers was his. Every city still had its priests, its scribes, its god in the inner sanctum. The granary administrators counted grain as they always had. Sargon had replaced the man at the top and left everything underneath in place. He had not built one empire, he had placed himself over 50. The cohesion was him, the loyalty of every governor, every garrison commander, every scribe keeping records for the new king of all the land ran through one man and one man only. He had understood exactly what Lugalzagesi had failed to understand. The question was whether he had understood what came after. He was not yet old. The campaigns ahead would stretch north and east and west into territories no Sumerian king had claimed. He had time. But at the city he had made his capital, his sons were growing up. An empire built by one man has already named its first problem. The empire needs a center. He did not take Lugalzagesi's throne. He took something the Sumerian kings had never thought to want, the space above all their thrones at once. What he needed now was a city that made that claim legible, a capital, his own. The Sumerian cities had names that stretched back to before memory: Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, each carrying its own god, its own record, its own story of how the world began. He would govern all of them. He would not govern from any of them. He chose a new place, the alluvial plain from the Persian Gulf north to the upper Euphrates. Hundreds of kilometers of river valley, a dozen major cities, the oldest agricultural land in the world. Animate the territory as a single connected system, grain routes and river roads binding it together. He called the new city Akkad. He named his empire after it, and his dynasty, and himself. Akkade in Sumerian, Akkad in his own tongue. Its exact location on or near the Euphrates has never been confirmed. Archaeologists have searched for more than a century. The city has not been found. The greatest city of the ancient world's first empire is a name on tablets and a silence in the ground. Every other center of this civilization left its walls for the spade. Akkad left only its documents. The records outlasted the city. Nothing else did. Into every city he had taken, he sent a governor. The man spoke Akkadian. His orders came from Akkad. His loyalty was not to the city he administered, not to its patron god or its old ruling families, but to the court that had appointed him and could remove him. Picture that governor arriving at the city gate. He has a clay tablet with his appointment pressed into it. He does not know the streets. He does not know which canal headman to speak to first, or which merchant guild the last administrator had managed to anger. He is learning everything. He left a number behind. It was not a modest number. 5,400 men eating bread before him every day. Not guests brought in for a ceremony. men who were there yesterday and would be there tomorrow. Soldiers, administrators, scribes, supply clerks, translators, runners carrying clay between the capital and every city on the plain. Before him, armies were raised by the season. Men put down the plow, marched, came home. What he was describing in that number was something different, a permanent force, fed year-round, answering to no city and no harvest. The cost of continuity paid in bread. Grain moving on the river roads, barges heading upstream carrying administrators and orders, barges heading downstream carrying tax assessments, census counts, surplus reports. Animate the Euphrates as a channel of command running in both directions at once. He standardized the weights, he standardized the measures. A unit of grain assessed in a city on the Persian Gulf now matched the same unit tallied in a city 300 kilometers north. One empire, one accounting. This is what sovereignty looks like before anyone invents the word. Sumerian had been the language of the scribes for 1,000 years. He did not abolish it. It stayed in the temples, in the old rituals, in the schools where boys learned to write by copying lists of fish and trees and gods. But across the plain, something had shifted. Akkadian cuneiform tablets now survive from this period in numbers. A Semitic language, writing an empire across a civilization it had not built, in a script its own people had not invented. The cities kept their gods. The paperwork changed. The paperwork was the empire. No confirmed portrait of his face exists. The bronze head found at Nineveh may be him, may be a later king. What survives without argument is the administrative record, the clay testimony of a system that required one mind at its center to hold its shape. Most of the men doing this work never saw him. They received orders on clay, carried those orders to the next tier down, collected accounts from the tier below, sent them back up. The empire was a chain of tablets passing between hands that had never met. He understood before anyone had a word for administration that swords take cities, records hold them. Every grain measure standardized was a claim the center still existed. Every governor's report received and answered was proof that Akkad, wherever it stood, was real. And all of it, the governors, the tablets, the measured grain, the 5,000 men eating bread, all of it converged on him. Not on the office, not on the dynasty, on the man, the one irreplaceable fact at the center of everything he had built. This is what building the world's first empire looked like from the inside. Not conquest, not procession, men learning the names of streets they had not grown up on, writing in a language their fathers had not used, measuring grain by a standard none of them had chosen. The machine he built was extraordinary. It taxed an empire spanning hundreds of kilometers. It moved armies. It translated civilizations into each other. It did all of this because one man stood at its center and refused to stop. What happened when he stopped is the next part of the story. Across the plain, in a dozen cities, men who did not know each other were pressing the same marks into clay, sending the same reports to the same center, using the same measures to count the same grain. A civilization had a nervous system, and it ran on one heartbeat. He could not hold it with armies alone. The cities were his. The tribute moved north along the river roads, and the governors he had placed answered to Akkad. But a city that does not believe it belongs to you is a city counting the days until it does not. Sumer and Akkad shared the same rivers and the same flat earth and almost nothing else. They spoke different languages. They called the same sky by different names. They had spent centuries not trusting each other from behind mud brick walls. An army can make enemies kneel. It cannot make them forget. What Sargon did next was not be act of a soldier. He took his daughter and gave her a title that had never existed before. High Priestess of Nana, the moon god, at the great temple at Ur. He made her the highest sacred voice in all of Sumer. Ur sat close to the mouth of the rivers, where the Euphrates spread toward the sea. It was the oldest wealth in the south, the city that remembered itself as the first city, and Nana's temple there was the axis on which southern Sumer believed the world turned. She would have come in procession. The city would have watched a woman in priestly robes lead the rituals that opened the year, that asked the moon to return, that fed the god his portion before any man ate his own. She was Akkadian by blood. She was Sumerian by office. Her face comes down to us in alabaster. The disc found at Ur bears an inscription identifying her, Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon. In the carving, she leads a ritual procession in layered robes. She is the first figure, the others follow. Picture her before dawn. The temple precinct is still cold. A scribe sits with fresh clay and a trimmed reed. She is not praying, she is composing. She is choosing, one word at a time, which goddess stands at the center of the world. The hymn she was building would do something armies could not. It would argue that Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, and Ishtar, her Akkadian counterpart, were not two goddesses. They were one. The same power, the same fury, two names for the same fire. She opens with power, not with supplication. The goddess she is praising owns the sky and the earth, and the will of every ruler beneath them. If the same goddess watched over Ur and over Akkad, if she answered to both names and accepted both offerings, then the priests of two cities were tending the same fire. That was the argument. It was dressed in poetry because poetry is what the temples believed. She did not stop at one hymn. She composed 42, one for each of the great temples of Sumer and Akkad, from Eridu in the deep south to the temples of the northern plain. Every house of every god, catalogued in verse, bound into one collection. Eridu at the river's mouth, Nippur at the center of the plain, Ur, Uruk, Lagash, Kish, all the way north to the Akkadian cities. She was naming the land one temple at a time, a map of worship drawn in verse. Scribal schools would copy her hymns for centuries after her death. Students learning cuneiform would press her words into fresh clay long after the dynasty she had served had ended, long after the empire her father built had collapsed into the memory of a memory. Then the revolt came. Sargon's enemies did not merely challenge his armies, they came for his daughter. She was pulled from the temple at Ur, stripped of her office, driven out. The woman who had spoken for the moon god was made a refugee by the same politics that had placed her there. She wrote about it. The hymn that survives describes what exile felt like, the night walk away from the altar she had tended, the silence of a god who does not intervene, the slow shame of a woman whose title had been everything and was now nothing. She named herself in it. Among the thousands of words written on clay in that century, hers are the first we know to carry a name still spoken. She was restored. The revolt that had cast her out did not outlast the empire that had placed her there. When order came back to Ur, the office came back to Enheduanna. She walked into the temple she had been removed from. The words she had written in exile were still clay. Consider what she had made. Not the political office, which could be stripped and restored and stripped again. The hymns. Those were not appointments. They were not robes a revolt could take. They were pressed into clay and copied by hands she would never see. Sargon built his empire on the irreplaceable fact of himself. Every campaign, every city taken, every governor installed required him to be alive and present and feared. He tried to solve what he could not solve by force, by giving the world a poet, his daughter. The empire would not last. The armies would scatter, the governors would stop answering, the cities would take back their own gods and their own names. But in scribal schools across the plain, a teacher would hand a student a piece of clay and say, "Copy this." She outlasted the empire. She outlasted the dynasty. She outlasted the language the scribes had used to copy her. She is the earliest author in recorded history whose name is still attached to their words. Armies do not do that. Stone does not do that. Clay and a woman who knew what to say. Beyond the cities, there was more world. He had the cities now. He had both rivers and the dark soil between them, and the man who had once called himself Lord of all Sumer, kneeling in the dust at Enlil's gate. The question a man like Sargon asks, once the plain is his, is what lies beyond. The world as Sargon understood it ran east to the mountains of Elam, west toward the cedar forests and the unknown sea, north into the hill country, and south through the channels of the great rivers to the Gulf and the islands beyond it. He moved first to the east. The city-states of Elam in the mountains and lowlands of what would become southwestern Iran had long traded with the cities of the plain and long raided them. Sargon brought them under Akkadian influence one by one until their kings acknowledged the new order. What drove him outward was not vanity alone. The alluvial plain that fed his cities grew no trees worth the name, no timber long enough to roof a palace, to spine a great ship, to build the doors of a temple that would last. For wood, a king had to reach. Northwest and west lay the mountain ranges Mesopotamian texts called the cedar forest, the slopes of the Amanus, and, further still, the ranges above the Levantine coast. Timber country the cities of the plain had looked toward for generations. Sargon turned an army in that direction. Picture the men of that army. They had grown up where the horizon was flat, and the tallest thing they ever saw was a ziggurat rising above the plain on its mud brick steps. They walked now into the foothills. The foothills kept rising. Then the trees. Not the low scrub of the riverbank or the date palms of the canal margins. These were cedars, and they rose until a man craning his neck could not find the top of them, and the air between them was cold in a way the plain had no word for. The soldiers moved in column through the shadow of the forest, men from the flat plain watching their footing on stone, their bronze catching no light under the canopy. They were not conquering geography, they were turning it into a story to carry back. Every campaign Sargon made was also a performance for the cities at home. His scribes recorded the distances, the directions, the names of the kings he defeated. The inscriptions were not simply records, they were arguments carved into stone that the man at the center of the world had touched its edges.
He claimed he washed his weapons in the upper sea. Scholars still weigh what that meant. The Mediterranean, some point along the Levantine coast where a soldier's spear was run through the surf and the act committed to writing. What he claimed mattered as much as what he reached. The stone does not record how far the army marched. It records that he reached the sea. That is what the inscription was for. Turn the map south. Beyond the river mouths, the Persian Gulf opened to Dilmun, a way station for the ancient world's long-distance trade. Copper from Magan, lapis lazuli from the mountains far to the east, carnelian from the distant Indus Valley. Sargon claimed dominion here too. What moved through Dilmun was not simply luxury. The lapis lazuli that colored the eyes of gods in Akkadian temples came through those routes. The copper that made the weapons that held the empire came through those routes. Trade and war were not separate policies, they were the same pressure. A later inscription, disputed among scholars, describes Sargon acting on behalf of Akkadian merchants at Purashanda, a city in what would become central Anatolia. If the account holds, then his reach extended further than any army needed to march, carried forward by traders operating under Akkadian protection. Lay that out on the ground. East to the mountains of Elam, south to the islands of the Gulf, northwest to the Cedar Ranges, west along the merchant roads of Anatolia. One center, the plain of Akkad, where no trees grew and no stone could be quarried. The title that would define Akkadian kingship was already forming in that geography. King of the Four Quarters, Lord of all the world and every direction a man could point. Its fullest official form would come with his heirs, but the concept belonged to Sargon's campaigns and to his scribes. Here's what the king needed to be in the understanding of his age. Not a general, though he was a general. Not merely an administrator, though what he was building required administration no one had yet attempted. He had to be a cosmological figure,
the man who reached the edge. The man who came back from the edge. That was what the cities required of him. Every campaign that ended with an inscription, weapons washed in distant water, submission received at the world's margins, was a ritual as much as a military operation. The soldier and the myth were not entirely separate things. The scribes who wrote the inscriptions understood this. They were not simply recording history. They were building a claim that would outlast any army. The king who could say he stood at the upper sea, at the Cedar Ranges, at the Gulf and its islands, was not merely powerful, he was necessary. And necessity was what he built into the foundation below the territory. Not just a kingdom, a concept, a center to the world. Akkad at the middle of it. And the man who held Akkad held the edge of things in every direction the world could be pointed. His heirs would inherit the title and the inscriptions and the concept of the four quarters. They would spend themselves maintaining what those words required. The world Sargon claimed with his weapons and his scribes was large enough to awe a generation. It was also large enough to swallow the next one. Around 2295 BC, the walls of Akkad still stand. He had conquered the plain in his youth and held it through his middle years, and now, somewhere on the far side of 50 years of war and governance, the plain made its final argument. Not a single enemy, not a rival who could be named and defeated. Everyone at once. The Sargon Chronicle names it without flourish. In his old age, all the lands revolted against him and besieged him in Akkad. Read that again. All the lands. Not one disgruntled city, not one ambitious general. All of it, simultaneously, deciding that the moment had arrived. The Sumerian cities to the south, their governors Akkadian, their memories long. The hill peoples to the northeast, the frontier territories watching for the distance between a demand and its answer. The empire's edges had always been the proof of its center. Now, the center was surrounded. The Sumerian cities had bent. They had not broken. For a generation, they had watched Akkadian governors sit in their temple precincts, directing revenues that had once stayed close to home. There are things a city absorbs for years. There are things it only waits to reverse. Picture the night sky above Akkad. The fires his enemies lit on the plain were visible from the walls, orange and low and spreading without hurry, the way a field looks when the harvest has been set deliberately alight. He had ordered that sight himself in other men's years. He was, by any accounting, an old man. He had been campaigning since before most of the soldiers besieging him were born. The world had arranged itself around his presence for 50 years. Now the world was testing what happened when that presence was contained behind a wall. Every city that had thought about revolt had spent years weighing the same calculation. Sargon might appear on the road with an army before the decision was final. That possibility, not any law, not any institution, had held them in place. The possibility required him to be possible. Inside the walls, the court felt it too. Men whose loyalty had been won personally over years of shared campaign and shared reward. Men who had followed him rather than followed a throne. Personal loyalty ages with the person it is attached to. It does not transfer. The Chronicle does not say how long the siege held. It does not record whether he was afraid. It states what happened. That is all it requires. He broke it. The same text records that, also without ceremony. He went out and suppressed them. The armies formed and moved and returned. The revolts collapsed the way revolts collapse when the man they were testing arrives to demonstrate that the test was premature. Notice what the suppression required. Not a general acting on his behalf, not a system capable of mobilizing while the king remained in his capital. It required Sargon to leave Akkad in person again, on the road, under the sky, the way it had always required him. The armies moved outward from Akkad, south along the river roads, northeast toward the hills, pressing the revolts back into the silence they had briefly broken. The plain went quiet. He came back to his capital with prisoners and with the empire, for now, intact. A flooded field goes quiet after the water pulls back. It does not go dry. The same grain still grows in the same soil. The same grievances still wait in the same cities. He had suppressed them, he had not dissolved them. Those are different things. The empire had worked all these years on a single structural principle. Not law, not a bureaucracy deep enough to enforce its own decisions, not a chain of governors trained to act without instruction. Sargon, present. That was the principle, and it had been enough, because he had been enough. The governors answered to him, the armies owed him, the cities paid tribute because he had made them pay, personally, within living memory. Take the man out of that sentence. What you have left is a list of obligations with no one remaining to enforce them. The Sumerian king list would give him 56 years, one of the longest reigns its scribes recorded. In the centuries after his death, kings with no blood claim to him would carve his name into their own inscriptions. The myth would outlast the man by a millennium. He had made himself the first thing of its kind. No one had shown him what came next because no one had ever arrived at this position to leave directions. An empire of this scale had not existed long enough before him for anyone to record its ending. There was no law of succession that anyone had agreed upon, no ceremony that transferred what he had accumulated, no written principle establishing who held the empire after Sargon, by what right, with what legitimacy. He had not built that, and the thing he had built was himself. Around 2279 BC, he died. No source records the cause. No inscription has survived that names the moment or says where it happened or what he left unfinished. He was there, then he was not. The chronicle, which preserved so much, preserves nothing about the end. What remained was the shape of what he had made. The idea that a single authority could reach from the Persian Gulf to the mountain passes of the north and call it one empire, one name. His heirs would spend their reigns learning how much of that idea had been him. The grain still moved, the scribes still wrote, the governors still sat in their precincts with their Akkadian titles and their Akkadian orders. The form was all there. It had always been the thing underneath the form that was irreplaceable. His heirs were about to find that out. Sargon is gone, the empire is not. Sargon of Akkad died around 2279 BC and left behind something no man had left before him, an empire, intact, waiting to be ruled by someone who had not built it. His oldest son Rimush stood at the threshold of the first empire the world had seen. The revolts began before the funeral smoke cleared. They came from every direction at once. Sumer rose, Elam rose. Cities that had bent under Sargon calculated correctly that a crown handed down sits lighter than one seized. They moved before Rimush could settle. The empire his father had forged in decades would have to be forged again in years. From the Sumerian plain to the foothills of Elam, the cities moved at the same moment, as if they had agreed beforehand, because most of them had. Coordinated revolt is not accident. It is a verdict on the man who must now answer it. Rimush answered. He did not negotiate. He marched, campaign after campaign, and his scribes recorded what followed in stone. Armies destroyed, soldiers killed, soldiers captured, cities brought back under the Akkadian heel. The language was the language of his father. The necessity was entirely different. The figures his scribes carved were large, almost certainly shaped by the purpose of all such numbers, to convince, to impress, to announce. But behind the exaggeration was real warfare, large-scale and repeated, seasons of it, the empire spending blood to remain the empire. He pushed east, past the Tigris, into Elam, reaching the cities of Awan and Zahara, territory his father had pressed against and that Rimush now struck harder. He was extending the reach of Akkad even while holding it together behind him, both things at once. Rimush's eastern campaign, the Akkadian army moving past the Tigris into the Elamite foothills, striking the cities of Awan and Zahara. He was not defending a perimeter. Under assault from every quarter, the empire was still reaching outward. 9 years. That is how long Rimush held it. 9 years of campaigns, 9 years of putting down the fires that broke out the moment his father died. Every external revolt he found, he crushed. No coalition of Sumerian cities outlasted him. No Elamite alliance held. He could not be beaten on the battlefield. Every army that came at him in open ground was broken. The Sumerian coalitions that rose in the first year of his reign were gone by the third, the fourth, the fifth. But there are places no army can follow a king. Around 2270 BC, Rimush died, not on campaign, not in the field. He died in the palace, in whatever room a king occupies when the armies are put away and the doors are closed and only the nearest men remain. He had reigned 9 years. What exactly happened, the record does not say with precision. What it says is that he was gone and that no army from outside had taken him. 9 years had been long enough to suppress every revolt he could see. It was not long enough. His brother Manishtushu stepped into the vacancy, a second son, now the second king of Akkad, holding an empire that had already outlasted one transition badly and was about to attempt another. The 32 kings came from the sea. That is how Manishtushu's own inscriptions described it, a coalition gathered on the far shore of the Persian Gulf who had watched what happened to every coalition that faced Rimush and came anyway. There are different kinds of courage. Manishtushu's campaign against the coalition, a combined naval and land operation reaching across the Persian Gulf and down the eastern shore, meeting the allied kings on ground they had chosen. His inscriptions claim a single campaign, a single result. Whether every number in his inscriptions hold exactly, the shape is clear enough. He sailed where his father had not sailed, and his brother had not lived to sail. He came back. The empire did not contract. It held again and kept holding. But Manishtushu was thinking about something his father had never needed to think about, and his brother had not lived long enough to address. He was thinking about the land itself, and about the men who held it, and about what made a man stay loyal. A large diorite monument, the obelisk of Manishtushu, recorded what he did with the fields of the Akkad region. Large land purchases in the Akkad region, fields bought from their owners and redistributed. Scholars read the obelisk as a program, build a class of landowners whose wealth was bound not to their city, not to any local temple, but to the crown sitting in Akkad. It was a different answer to the same question. Rimush had answered revolt with armies. Manishtushu was addressing what lay underneath the revolts, which was not how to suppress disloyalty, but how to manufacture loyalty, to give men something they would not trade away for a rebellion's promise. 15 years. Manishtushu reigned 15 years, longer than his brother, long enough to sail a gulf no Akkadian king had sailed and carve his program into diorite. He had answered every challenge the world outside the walls could offer. Not long enough. Around 2255 BC, Manishtushu died in the palace, the same way his brother had died, the same proximity, the same men nearest to him. 2 of Sargon's 3 immediate successors, removed not by any coalition, not by any army from outside, but what waited in the room at the end of the corridor. His grandfather made an empire. He decided that was not enough. The empire passed to Naram Sin through 2 generations of kings who had spent their reigns doing what his grandfather had never needed to do, convincing people the thing was real. It came to him already cracking at the seams. The cities rose against him early, not 1 or 2, a coalition. Every major city in the river plain rising in the same season as if they had agreed to it beforehand. The record of it survives in his own inscriptions. The revolt was not a border incident. It was the shape of the whole empire lit up at once, every city that had ever submitted to Akkad announcing together that it would not submit again. He fought at least 8 major battles in a single year. His own inscriptions record this without apology. 8, perhaps more, moving from one uprising to the next before the last one had time to breathe. Each one had to be won. He won them all. The cities bent again. The empire held. He had done what his predecessors had struggled to do, and he had done it faster, harder, with less room for error than any year the Akkadian throne had yet seen. What he did next, when the campaigns were finished and the quiet had returned, was to sit with the problem his grandfather had never solved. Force could suppress a revolt, it could not prevent the next one. The empire needed something more durable than a man. He pushed further than Sargon had reached, south to Magan on the shores beyond the Gulf, east into the Zagros Mountains against the Lulubi, northwest against Amorite peoples in Syria. The boundaries of Akkad under his hand were the widest they would ever be. The map of the empire in his reign was a different shape than the one Sargon had left. Larger by every measure, it pressed against coastlines and mountain ranges that no Akkadian army had touched before. His daughter was appointed high priestess at the same office Sargon had given Enheduanna a generation before. What had begun as a singular appointment was now opposed to the dynasty owned, a thread of religious authority woven into the fabric of administration. A king who survived what no Akkadian ruler before him had faced. Every city rising at once, in the same year. He beat them all in 12 months. What he did with that knowledge would redefine what a king was allowed to claim he was. The political problem was this. Every time a new man sat on the throne in Akkad, the cities of Sumer had to be persuaded again. The king's authority rested on his fathers, and his fathers on Sargon's, and Sargon had rested on nothing but the irreducible fact of Sargon. A man could inherit a throne. He could not inherit the quality that had built it. The cities knew this. They had tested it every time the succession changed, and they had been right every time. Naram-Sin looked at the pattern and drew his conclusion. He stepped across the boundary between the human and the divine. He did it publicly, permanently, in the written record of his own kingdom. He was not the first man in history to be called a god. He was the first in Mesopotamia to demand it. A star carved before his name, the divine determinative, the mark reserved until that moment for gods alone. His full title became King of the Four Quarters of the world. The four quarters, every direction the eye could reach, every land the sun crossed, everything that existed. It was the most explicit claim to universal sovereignty any ruler had yet set into words. Consider what the title required of the listener. Not simply that he ruled a large territory, that the world had a king, and his name was Naram-Sin. To stand outside his borders was not to be free, it was to be uncounted. He had the victory carved in stone, pink limestone shaped like a mountain, 2 meters tall, a monument that would travel across centuries after his death, passing as plunder from one people to the next, each taking it as proof of what greatness looked like. At the center of the carving, a figure ascends the mountain. His soldiers climb below him. The bodies of the Lulubi people lie where they fell, some twisted in the stone, some still reaching upward, the grammar of defeat rendered in shallow relief. He wears a horned helmet. The horns are not decoration. They are the visual language of the divine in this world, the sign worn by gods in every image the river civilizations had produced across 1,000 years. He is wearing them. He is taller than his soldiers, taller than the mountain, taller than the enemies who die at his feet. Scale in the art of this world was not accident. The largest figure in any image was the most important thing in it. He had made himself the largest. It is not a record of one battle. It is a manifesto. He is not announcing a victory. He is announcing a category of person that had not existed before him. The stele is in the Louvre. The empire is not. The carving survives. He does not. An empire outlives its builder by a generation. Then the questions begin. Picture a man who woke each morning under the weight of his grandfather's name, Shar-Kali-Shari, king of all kings. He had the throne Sargon built and the title Naram-Sin carried. He had the machinery of an empire. He also had enemies that machinery was not built to hold. The empire he ruled was real. It still held cities, still moved grain along roads Sargon had opened, still sent governors to the far provinces. But it was the kind of real a fire is when the fuel is running low. It gave heat. Something was going. From the west, through the scrubland beyond the Euphrates, came the Amorites, pastoral people moving in numbers the frontier posts could not turn back. From the east, out of the Zagros Mountains, came something harder to meet on a battlefield, the Gutians. They were a people of the high passes of the Zagros, a country of cold rock and narrow valleys that the empire's administrators had always regarded as the edge of the useful world. They did not come as an army. They came in bands. There is a difference. An army has a front. You can watch it come, position against it, study its route, and settle the question in an afternoon. Bands have no front. They appear at the canal junction, at the grain depot, at the road where the garrison was stretched too thin to cover. Shar-Kali Shari fought. The inscriptions say he campaigned against the Amorites in the west and the Gutians in the east, that he held victories, that he built temples and maintained the forms. He ruled for roughly 24 years. That is longer than most men manage a disintegrating thing. He died. We do not know how, and we do not know exactly when. What the record gives us is the absence that came after, the way a fire leaves silence where it burned. After Shar-Kali Shari, the line of Sargon was done. The scribes who kept the king list faced something they had never faced. They wrote it down the only way they could. 4 names appeared in rapid succession. 4 men who held something called the kingship, and then did not. The scribes listed them but seemed uncertain what they were recording. They assigned no glory to the period, no great campaigns, no buildings. They gave it a question. Over decades, the Gutians moved deeper into the river plain, not as conquerors announcing themselves, but as pressure without a center, filling the space the Akkadian garrisons had left, occupying what no one was defending. What that meant for anyone living on the plain was this: the letter you sent to the capital brought no answer. The garrison meant to hold the road was gone, or hungry, or had changed sides for a bag of grain. The empire was a name with nothing behind it. The canals, which required constant coordinated labor to maintain, began to silt when the authority that organized that labor fractured. The cities that had grown fat on surplus found the surplus shrinking. The plain that had made everything possible was beginning to forget how to feed itself. And then there was the city from which everything had been commanded. The city Sargon built and named that Naram-Sin filled with tribute from a dozen conquered peoples. There had been a moment when Akkad was the center of the known world. Nobody wrote the date it emptied. Nobody recorded the last governor's name or the last cart rolling out through the gate. It did not fall with the sound that history could hear. It thinned, and then it was gone. A generation after the fall, the scribes at Nippur had a problem. Something enormous had happened. The largest political structure the world had ever produced had come apart, and the people living after it needed to understand why. They had no framework for it. They wrote a text we call the Curse of Akkad. It was not a chronicle. It was a search for meaning, set down perhaps a century after the fact, shaping the disaster into a form the available language could hold. What could explain the fall of something unprecedented? The gods. The text described divine anger, a king who had overreached, a city abandoned by the forces that once protected it. Whether those events occurred as the text describes, the text itself cannot verify. It was written to explain a catastrophe, not to document one. The two are not the same. But observe what the text reveals even so. A world with no precedent for what had just occurred. The first empire fell, and the people who came after could only reach for the one explanation that already existed. They were not wrong to be overwhelmed. Nothing like this had happened before. The Gutian period lasted roughly 100 years. The cities endured. Nippur kept its scribes and its temple. The Sumerian language survived. The knowledge of how to dig a canal, how to press grain into a tablet, how to count a year's surplus, all of it continued. Around 2112 BC, a king named Ur-Nammu founded the third dynasty of Ur and restored order to the plain. A new empire, more administratively elaborate than anything Sargon had built, rose on the same rivers and the same surplus. It had the first empire to learn from.
The city Sargon built is still not found. No ruin has been confirmed as its site. Archaeologists have searched the Mesopotamian plain for generations. The capital of the world's first empire has no address on any map anyone can draw. It is as if the ground itself took it back. Sargon built on the irreplaceable fact of himself. The empire that followed spent 80 years trying to be him. When it could not, it thinned into the ground so completely that the ground has given nothing back. What cannot be inherited cannot be held. The empire is dust, the name is not. He sits in a scriptorium in Nineveh in the 7th century before the Common Era, and the clay in front of him is still fresh. He is a scribe. He has been given a story to copy. The man the story is about died 1600 years ago. The story goes like this. A woman gave birth in secret. She placed the child in a basket of rushes, sealed it with bitumen, and set it on the river. A water drawer found the boy. He raised him. The boy grew. He became the greatest king the world had ever known. The scribe was not there. No ancestor of his was there. The man these words describe turned to dust before any forebear of this scribe drew breath. He copies the story carefully anyway, because a king has asked him to. The king has his reasons. His name is Sargon II, king of Assyria, and his empire stretches from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. His real birth name is lost to us. What he chose to call himself was Sharu-Ken, the true king. The first Sargon's name, borrowed across 1600 years. You do not borrow a name like that by chance. You reach across 16 centuries of silence and take hold of something that still has weight, and you raise it in front of your armies and your enemies. You say, I am that. I continue that. The name does the work a lineage cannot. The empire itself was gone. Akkad had collapsed long before Sargon II was born. Its dynasty shattered under the grandsons. The armies dissolved. The cities that had bent gone back to their own rhythms. What remained of the man who built it was a story, a name, a few copied words. But the language he had used to run that empire outlasted the empire by 1,000 years. Akkadian moved city to city, carried not by armies, but by scribes. It became the tongue kings used when they needed to speak to each other. In Egypt, a pharaoh wrote to Hittite kings and Babylonian governors. The letters were written in Akkadian, not because any of them were Akkadian people, because that was the language of correspondence. The language a man named Sargon had once used to tell the world what it owed him. Boys learning to write in Assyrian scribal schools copied this text. They pressed these words into clay until the words were part of them. In those same schools, students copied a hymn. Its author was a woman named Enheduanna, Sargon's daughter, the first named author in the history of writing. She was dead. She had been dead for a very long time. They were still copying her words. Around 2100 BC, scribes of the third dynasty of Ur compiled the story of every king who had ever ruled. They gave Sargon 56 years in most versions. They set his name inside a record stretching back beyond memory, back to a time before any living man could count. His name held its place. Among the things he had claimed, one phrase outlasted nearly all the rest. King of the four quarters, Lord of the whole world. Babylonian kings claimed it. Assyrian kings claimed it. Persian kings, centuries later, claimed it too. The city of Akkad could not be found. Later Babylonian rulers knew the name. They tried to place themselves inside its story, to restore it, to stand where he had stood. They found nothing above ground. The city had gone back into the silt it was built from, completely, without ceremony.
Consider what that means. Kings across 2,000 years were still invoking the name of a city that did not exist above the earth. They were paying tribute to a place that lived only in tablets. The legend was real. The city was gone. The scribe in Nineveh finishes his tablet. He sets it on the shelf among the others. He has never seen Akkad. He will not see it. No one alive in his century has seen it. The first empire has dissolved without leaving a stone above ground. He places the tablet carefully and walks out. Sargon II understood something. The name still worked. An empire built on one man's will and presence had left behind a shape, a category, an expectation of what a great king was supposed to be, and every king who came after was still trying to fill it. He had asked a question first, before any of them, before Babylon and Assyria and Persia. A man with no crown and no bloodline and no city to call his own had stood in the dust of Sumer and asked whether one word could hold the whole world together. What no one could replicate was how he started. They came to their empires with armies assembled, with cities at their backs, with names that carried lineage. He had arrived with none of it. That is the part of the story the scribes kept copying, the beginning, not the middle. Every conqueror who came after was still answering it. Some spent a lifetime discovering the answer was no. None of them stopped asking. The question was the inheritance. The empire was not. His city is gone. His dynasty is dust. He left no stone above the earth that can be named his. What he left was the idea that it could be done, that one man, from nothing, could hold the whole world in one hand. Every empire that came after him was built inside that thought. Every empire you know started with a question first asked here, in a city that no longer exists. Subscribe. More is coming.